Ladies and gentlemen, I like to begin my talks in this traditional manner, not only because I've always done so, but because it's recently become a target for the linguistic detectives of the woke intelligentsia. A railway company in Britain, after a complaint from a passenger, recently suspended a train conductor who had begun an announcement with this shocking form of address. Coincidentally, it's also the punchline from an old Soviet-era anti-communist joke. Some late Soviet citizens were wondering how the party would finally announce that communism, then visibly frail, had finally collapsed. One of them said they'll never announce it formally. It's too embarrassing for them to admit it. We'll simply wake up one morning, turn on the radio and hear the announcer say, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." Those are words that symbolize an ordered society in which people respect one another. They're not signs of class discrimination or hostility to the other. On the contrary, they occur most often in an address to everyone at a large public meeting. They convey a recognition that people we don't know are nonetheless people of equal or perhaps superior merit to ourselves. We assume the best about them without evidence and with no expectation of being disappointed. There's a great deal more than ordinary politeness and good manners than merely service harmony. They mean that people expect to get along with others and that they will treat people fairly in their dealings. They're the preliminary to many good things, from trade to conversation. Good manners are the introduction to a civil society, and it's significant that the left in its various manifestations has always hated and sought to undermine them. So it's not necessarily a good thing that ladies and gentlemen has become a defiant counter-revolutionary gesture. Something is being lost when that happens. But if the left is determined to eradicate good manners, we should nonetheless speak it boldly and unapologetically while we can, before we have to whisper it quietly behind our hands, hiding in the catacombs. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the New Direction think tank and the Fundación Civismo for inviting me to this summer school and to express my great regret that I can't be with you in person in the beautiful city of Madrid, enjoying the social side of an important intellectual occasion for conservatives and classical liberals, and meeting old and valued friends like Pedro Schwartz, who knows more than any Englishman about the glories of the Anglo-Scottish tradition of classical liberal political economy. Of course, the fact that a train conductor can be reprimanded and suffer loss of income for using a form of address that is legal, respectful, traditional, and still widely used in society, if less frequently, that must be seen as a sign that conservatism is in a bad way. And alas, that is the case. And so it is the case on both sides of the Atlantic, and conservatives are among the first to say so. Here is one critic, unknown to me, but maybe someone can give me his name, but I'm pretty certain he's the deeply disillusioned conservative from the tone of his remark, even if he doesn't realize it himself. I quote, "Conservatism is a corpse being eaten by maggots. The left supports the maggots. Conservatives support the corpse." Yes, it makes one wince. So let's hear a more measured critique from the great English Catholic and lifelong liberal G.K. Chesterton. I quote, "The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent the mistakes from being corrected." When you think about it, that's a more savage criticism than the first, and it's a criticism very often heard from those English conservatives like Evelyn Waugh, who complain that the Tory party has never put the clock back a single minute. People might quibble with that because of Brexit. But the gloomiest forecast of conservatism's prospects that I've yet heard was voiced very seriously 2 months ago at a meeting of the Philadelphia Society. That's maybe America's leading gathering of academic conservatives, by the distinguished philosopher Robert C. Koons. Here is the third paragraph of his remarks, which I'll shortly be publishing in the Hungarian Conservative magazine. I quote, "For the moment, for our movement to go forward, it's essential that we divest ourselves of any comforting illusions about our nation or our civilization. We're not defenders of a menaced status quo. We're not even a beleaguered minority within a diseased system. We're entirely outside the commanding heights of our culture. We have no presence to speak of within elite colleges and universities, elite media, journalism, the arts, entertainment, ecclesiastical hierarchies, the boardrooms and C-suites of corporate America. And we have no chance of being readmitted to these circles of power. Professor Coons makes good his claim with a series of examples of how in the last few decades the American Academy has gradually been conquered by left progressives whom we now describe quite absurdly as social justice warriors, and who have successfully imposed a soft totalitarianism on faculty and students. That totalitarianism is becoming less and less soft as it meets less and less resistance. A few examples will make the point better than any analysis. 1. When asked, 447 academics were asked in a poll if they would be afraid or nervous of expressing an opinion that was controversial in front of their academic colleagues. They answered as follows. 33% said very concerned. 27% answered extremely concerned that their reputations would be tarnished. As to the hypothetical question, if your career would be hurt, 25% answered very concerned. 27% answered extremely concerned. Secondly, Coons reports that the University of Texas recently adopted an equity and inclusion policy that requires faculty to endorse, in effect, what are the left's principles when they are hired. That, of course, would keep dissenters out of the university in the first place. As he notes, it's not simply a Marxist approach, it's a Maoist one, taken straight from the history of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. 3. Exactly the same comparison is made by the social critic John McWhorter, writing in The Atlantic magazine. When the professor committed the sin of privileging the white male perspective by giving a lecture on the philosophy of one of the founding fathers, the college administration tried to make him sit in a listening circle in which his job was to stay silent while students explained how he had hurt them. In other words, the 21st century American version of a struggle session straight out of the Cultural Revolution again. One could continue with many stories of this soft cultural totalitarianism in academic life. They've been occurring now for many years. For most of the time, however, the rest of America, comforted itself with the thought that these outrages were confined to a handful of gender, cultural, and social studies departments in Ivy League colleges. That was always a false comfort. Ivy League colleges may be small in number, but they are hugely influential. The standards they adopt are soon mimicked in state universities and community colleges, and Ivy League graduates go straight from graduation to the major law schools, corporations, Wall Street offices, media newsrooms, and into Hollywood. They write the laws, the regulations, the headlines, the movies, the sitcoms, and they shape the surrounding culture in which the rest of us move and live. And after 30 years of producing good little totalitarians, the universities have now managed to spread their atmosphere to the rest of society in ways large and small. The exclusive prep schools traditionally used by America's leadership class to bring up its sons and daughters have embraced the same curriculum rooted in critical race theory as the colleges. The establishment's kids are now being educated to be revolutionaries. There's some irony in the fact that John McWhorter's critical report of academic Marxism appeared in The Atlantic, because when The Atlantic, thinking rightly that it needed a talented conservative writer to match its overwhelmingly liberal come progressive staff, it hired Kevin Williamson to be just that. At that point, the junior reporting staff and editors, more ideologized and less tolerant than their senior colleagues, rebelled against the hiring of Williamson and forced the editors to dismiss him, dismissing, therefore, one of the most brilliant writers in American journalism today, and that's what they did. The New York Times proudly published its 1619 Project, a series of reports that supposed and hoped to shape the paper's overall coverage of race issues. The series argued that the real date of the founding of America was not 1776, but 1619, when the first African slaves arrived in the American colonies. Slavery, the series insisted, was the leitmotif of American history. Professional historians, left and right, pushed back against this interpretation as extreme and essentially false. My former National Review colleague, Richard Brookhiser, pointed out that the colony to which the 1619 slaves had arrived no longer had any of the marks of that slavery, but it held elections regularly. So, which was the stronger tradition in American history, slavery or democracy? Under strong intellectual pressure, the New York Times softened its more extreme claims. But the 1619 Project is now becoming part of every high school's history lesson. Andrew Sullivan, New York Magazine's most distinguished columnist, a former editor of the New Republic, reacted to the 1619 Project by observing that he was constantly being told that critical race theory was confined to a few university departments and no threat to anyone or anything. Yet, here it had become the official reporting doctrine of America's main newspaper of record. As a result of that, of course, it was bound to become the main reporting doctrine, or how to report the news, in most of America's newsrooms. Andrew was the first of a series of distinguished defenestrations of liberal or moderate conservative writers from magazines and publishing houses, now staffed by younger, woke writers who believe that their views of social justice trump free speech and free debate. That's happened too to one distinguished left-wing writer. We should realize that the legal background accompanying this cultural development was outlined in a book by Christopher Caldwell, The Age of Entitlement, which was accepted as brilliant even by hostile reviewers. In that book, he pointed out that because of successive decisions by American courts, the 1964 Civil Rights Act had in effect created a new constitution for the United States, a new constitution that overrode all sorts of constitutional protections for individual rights in the earlier constitution and replaced them with group rights. That new constitution in practice treated any statistical difference in racial outcomes as proof of discrimination, requiring state intervention and correction. In effect, America had two constitutions, and the 1964 one was gradually triumphing over the 1776 one in the spirit of the Times' 1619 Project. That means overall the intrusion of both state and of the ideas that drive this cultural revolution into the most amazing areas, surprising areas of national life. You might imagine that medicine would be exempt. Not so. As Professor Coons points out, medical doctors in America are now forbidden to urge caution about sex change operations and treatments. Indeed, they are in danger of losing their license to practice medicine if they do not encourage parents to obstruct the natural social development of any child who expresses even a momentary interest in transitioning to a different gender. There is resistance to this, of course, and some lawsuits are being mounted by unhappy people who have transitioned and now wish to detransition and to sue their doctors for not explaining honestly the disadvantages of altering one's gender medically and the possibility that the desire to do so might pass when adolescence passes. But the establishment view remains that the child must be encouraged to pursue a sex change he or she feels rather than to question it. To question it could be transphobia and potentially criminal. Now, that ends my list of American experiments in social justice, and I have not mentioned yet the outrageous behavior of the American mainstream media and high-tech social media in censoring not only conservative opinions, but also news stories that embarrassed the left in last year's presidential election. I've concentrated on America so far because we've always had the feeling that America would in the end be the final rock of resistance to socialism, Marxism, Maoism, or whatever happened to be the prevailing left-wing political heresy. And that no longer seems to be the case. Of course, all the trends we've just looked at in America are also present in Europe, usually less extreme in form, but not always. On the last point I raised, there is currently a lawsuit going through the English courts in which it appears that the Tavistock Clinic, one of the most established institutions dealing with sexual and psychological medicine in Britain, has not fully carried out its duty to inform young potential transgender patients of the risks and disadvantages of such surgery. If that proves to be the case, it will be a grave scandal, and it will force some rethinking on the legal and medical professions. But I've recently had experience, personal, of another less serious scandal. My institute in Budapest, the Danube Institute, has had as a visiting fellow Rod Dreher, the distinguished US journalist and author of The Benedict Option, and most recently the book Live Not by Lies, a quote from Solzhenitsyn. This second book explores the experiences of former Central European dissidents who had emigrated to the US or Western Europe and who for some years had felt an eerie sense of déjà vu watching the news at home. What they witnessed in the liberal democracies on both sides of the Atlantic increasingly reminded them of what they had experienced growing up, the communist system of censorship, thought control, and fear. Some had even returned to Central Europe, where they felt the experience of really existing socialism in the past would protect them against any nostalgic recurrence of it in the future. Rod and those he spoke to about these feelings, and also about some of the terrible sufferings that religious dissidents had suffered in the Soviet Union and its satellites, they make a disturbing case, and one we should all reflect on. They've given us a warning, and it's hard to imagine a topic that more needs our considered attention. But will we be allowed to reflect on it? The journalist who showed Rod around Bucharest, where he attracted a large crowd to his book signing and sold 400 copies, has written to him telling him that Facebook has removed a report of the event from its pages. As he commented on this news, he said, "What better way to prove there is no totalitarianism than by banning discussion about it?" My guess is that everyone in the audience in Madrid could give a dozen other examples of this kind of politically correct censorship and of the fear of speaking honestly and openly that it generates. What explains it? Well, here's Professor Koons's attempt to do so. I quote, "They built a totalitarian regime in the name of individualism, free markets, freedom and democracy. Leftism turned out to be a frame of mind, an impulse of hatred for our religion, our nation, our civilization, a spiritual pathology rather than a coherent set of doctrines and arguments." I think there you hear some echoes of the book The Demon in Democracy by the Polish politician and statesman Richard Legutko. I'll leave that thought with you and move on to how we counter this new threat. Both Dreher and Koons agree on one important response. They believe if conservatism is to survive, it must do so, at least initially, in the catacombs. It must develop its own parallel society, its own schools, universities, newspapers, electronic media, social media, more summer schools too, I guess. If nothing else, and if necessary, if we feel that the mainstream Conservative Party has lost its way, then we should encourage the development of new parties to ginger it up. If nothing else, the new Conservative Party will force its older brother to return to the faith. Now those kind of impulses to build a new alternative to the corrupt institutions of the modern state is happening in America and Britain. Again, both Rod Dreher and Robert Koons give a long list of schools, institutions which offer classical teaching and some religious in profession, usually Catholic, but by no means all. I was present at the launch of a European one, the Collegium Intermarium, only 2 weeks ago in Warsaw. And it is obviously something which is being driven by important ideas and by strong passions to retain European culture and prevent its corruption, or attempt to do so. But the strategy of building alternative institutions, though necessary and valuable, is not sufficient. To pursue this strategy, we also need to compel the mainstream political structure to protect the areas of liberty in which we can build those alternative institutions over a long period of time. And a long period of time is what we will need to make fundamental change. That means we need, in the meantime, to continue, indeed to increase, our involvement in politics, to protect ourselves from the corrupt soft totalitarianism of our major institutions. Here is where hope comes in. We need not despair about the prospects of doing this. Politically speaking, conservatism is not doing badly on both sides of the Atlantic. In the US, the Republican Party controls more than half the state legislatures and governorships, and it's within a few seats of winning both houses of Congress in 2022. I don't take that for granted, but it's the way to bet. Considered politically, the situation in Europe is better, even better. What is most striking about the politics of Europe today is that in almost all countries, the conventional left is on the defensive. It scarcely exists in Poland, Hungary, France, Italy, the UK, outside Scotland, and many other countries. The voters of the left, traditionally its constituencies, are defecting to new populist parties of the left, parties that are often ideologically vague or green or make up their policies as they go along. But parties that satisfy the taste for collectivism more effectively than mainstream social democrats. But those parties will take time to establish themselves and gain the necessary support. In the meantime, socialism and social democracy are losing their traditional working class base and becoming parties for middle class intellectuals and public sector workers. The workers, by contrast, are moving right and forcing conservative parties to support cultural and national solidarity as well as economic liberty in their mix for manifestos. I think that's a plus. We are likely in future to have a larger natural constituency for conservative and classical liberal policies when we fight for our liberties. Standing back from the purely partisan struggle, we can see that a broadly similar structure is emerging throughout the West. Conservatism wins elections sometimes, maybe even most times. The left controls all the institutions of cultural, legal, bureaucratic and economic power almost all the time. There are a few exceptions to that, particularly in Central Europe, but it looks to be the common pattern in most Western countries. This is an unfair fight in which the right wins most of the battles in elections, but the left wins most of the battles that take place in unaccountable institutions such as the courts, the bureaucracies, international bodies, and so on. The left finds the occasional victories of the right intolerable, and that's why it is growing in a totalitarian mindset. So in this situation, we have a larger section of the people on our side than before. And we want to win as many elections as we can, and therefore we need the policies to win them. I just want to offer a few reflections on that. The first thing we should remember, I think, both conservatives and classical liberals, is that we need to reject a completely needless and false civil war developing between the supporters of liberty on the one hand and the supporters of national solidarity on the other. Too many conservatives have been persuaded to abandon free market ideas and to accept a myth of the stagnant economies. I want to offer just a few pointers to what we should be thinking of doing here. First of all, we've got to overcome and reject a completely unnecessary and false civil war on the right. Too many conservatives are proposing to abandon the free market and to accept a myth that the economies of the West have stagnated as a result of pursuing the market too strongly. That is in fact false. This is not a level playing field politically, and it explains why some conservative governments in Europe want to strengthen the elected government in relation to the liberal institutions that can block it. The EU is the largest such restraint in today's Europe, and conservatives generally should want to see Brussels return some of its powers to national capitals. That's especially important in relation to taxation, which both the EU and now the G7 are attempting to harmonise in a way that penalises low tax and low regulation countries. These attempts violate the important conservative principle of jurisdictional competition, and if they proceed, they would turn the EU, into a cartel of governments, colluding with each other to keep the price of government high. Conservatives should oppose that in principle, and liberals too. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves living in a situation of taxation without representation, financing inefficient and unresponsive global and/or Euro governance. We should be on the side of the taxpayer. On economics, it's more or less vital that conservatives and classical liberals should combine to defend and indeed celebrate the achievements of the 1980s. Not only did Reagan, Thatcher and their European partners such as President Aznar create the economic reforms that enabled their countries to enjoy an economic recovery and boom that lasted from 1982 to the 2008 financial crash, which occurred under very different management. That's a boom of 26 years. Never forget, though, that those policies also lifted 3 billion people throughout the world, especially in Asia and Africa, from abject poverty into a middle-class lifestyle. That was one of the greatest liberation movements in human history. Naturally, the left has lied about it and can't stand the idea, and tragically, some conservatives now join them in attacking the free market and classical economics and attacking this myth and supporting, rather, the myth of economic stagnation. Of course, conservatives should not idolize the market. To borrow an insight from the founder of Christianity about the Sabbath, one might say that the market was made for man, not man for the market. We should be prudent in dealing with mercantilist nations like China and dealing with monopolists in domestic economies. We need good safety nets and the insurance principle for those who fail, sometimes or even often in life. But it's also true that the laws of economics are real, and that defying them is a policy that always ends in tears. As my old boss, Margaret Thatcher, said once, "You can't buck the market, and if you try, the market will buck you." She was proved right with almost indecent speed when the pound was forced out of the ERM in 1993, and the UK economy flourished for the next 13 years. Anti-market policies cannot be part of any sensible conservative policy, and we should realise it and call off what I hope is a very brief civil war. Briefly now, there are 3 other advantages we have on our side against the woke radicals and the milder progressives who now form the new establishments of America and Europe. The first is that they are utopians, and utopians are inevitably discredited by events in the real world. Never forget that events in the real world change things. They reveal that a policy is mistaken or even catastrophic. If you look at what's happened in Europe in recent years on the euro, on migration, and now on net zero, we find that our masters have been following policies that were mistaken from the start and that eventually had to be abandoned. That hasn't yet happened to net zero, but is going to happen, and we should be aware of that. Remember, too, that the present dominance of our opponents is shaky. Their policies are foolish. They are divided between radicals and progressives, and they are unpopular. Over time, as they proceed, as they nudge society in the wrong direction, they will be making people live with the politicization of everything. And that's not a world that most people want to live in. So the task of restoring a fully democratic society that allows and encourages free opinion and open debate is a task, a very formidable task, almost as formidable as that which faced Gramsci in the Frankfurt School. It may be an even more formidable task, because the Gramscian Marxists, the 68ers and other left progressives who conducted the long march through our social, legal and cultural institutions were able to do so partly because those institutions were run and staffed by people of a genuinely liberal cast of mind. They didn't impose, they didn't discriminate against able colleagues on political grounds. They didn't impose political tests for apolitical appointments. But those who run the institutions today are far more like Mussolini's fascists, who imprisoned Gramsci because, as the public prosecutors said, for 20 years we must stop this brain from functioning. Our new masters show a similar willingness to impose a softer authoritarianism on society through mechanisms like political correctness that ban entire topics from public debate and that penalize heretics by depriving them of their jobs, even jobs of no ideological significance. In these circumstances, conservatives and liberals must use the resources of democratic politics if they are to survive and eventually to triumph. Of course, if we are successful, we will still face the difficulties we've discussed earlier, namely that an elected government will face an intransigent radical establishment determined to maintain its independent powers and to impose its cultural dogmas on society. In that conflict, however, the woke social justice politicians labour under important disadvantages. The first one is that where conservatives aim to maintain and improve society from an attitude of respect towards its prevailing ideas, radicals seek to transform society in line with novel academic theories that always have difficulty surviving once they are exposed to the light of criticism. Their dogmas outrage common sense. They provoke opposition among those who have either not become true believers or who have not yet been intimidated or bribed into compliance. Consider the weakness of some of the most significant ideas embedded in woke ideology. It is not true that racism is whatever anyone perceives to be racism. It is not reasonable that women must always be believed whatever the evidence. It is not good public policy that statistics should not be collected if they're likely to contradict leftist preconceptions. For instance, that children prosper equally in all kinds of family structures. It's not possible to believe that all cultures are equal if you believe that all human beings are equal, since some cultures deny human equality and justify treating whole classes of human beings as inherently inferior. And it's self-destructive for a nation to think that sovereignty is trivial or meaningless or mythical, when it clearly means having the power to order your own affairs. The Greek people understand after the last 8 years what the loss of sovereignty can mean in practical affairs. Most voters realize instinctively that these things are nonsense. They don't require much persuasion. Conservatives only lose such battles when we fail to fight them. But remember, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan achieved great things and triumphed. The Chinese cultural revolutionaries, those who survive, they have been apologizing for their brutality ever since. Thank you.